Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy here at Catholic Studies Academy. And we're going to pick up our conversation that we had last time talking about the myth of self. And what we want to do is dive a little more deeply into this subject and look at this idea of the true self and the false self, and really try to gain a little bit better understanding. And most importantly, because it is such a prevalent bad idea right now,
right.
that a lot of people are falling into. And even in Catholic circles, there's many, you can find articles in even Catholic circles about this idea of your true self, as if it's distinct from somebody else. I don't know.
Right.
It's kind of vague. And so you could find these in many different Catholic circles. And so we just really want to try to address this. And one of our goals here at Catholic Studies Academy and on this podcast is to help refute error. And so, Dr. Smith, let us begin. And as we get started, can we, how about we do a quick review of kind of overview of what we did last time with regards to identifying this myth?
Yeah. So I think the problems with this really come out, especially. I mean, I think we did a good job last time bringing out some of the problems, but especially when we get into ideas of what genuine self-knowledge means, and what it means to understand oneself. I think it really comes out because I think there is a form of genuine self-knowledge, right, that we're called to, but that I think this false idea of the self very often brings in, right, a form of self-knowledge that's also false, right? And almost kind of a pseudo-mysticism that's associated with it. But before talking about that, just a little bit of a review. We talked last time about the idea, right, that out of modern philosophy, as well as other sources, there's a lot actually that goes into building up this idea of the modern self. Psychology, certainly certain elements of psychology played an important role in that. But eventually what emerges is, and this is pretty clear by the time we get to the 19th century, is the idea of your true self as undefined consciousness, right? And so that your true self, right, the true subject, right, of your actions and passions, your true identity, I guess, right, is undefined. It's not defined by your body, for sure. Right. So, in the 60s, very often you'd hear feminists say biology is not destiny. Right. And what they meant by that, right, is, I'm not my body. I can't be defined by the fact that I can have babies. Right. I'm different than that. I am something other than my body. Right. So strange. Right. When you think about how scientific and materialistic we are in every other field. Right. But when it comes to this question of identity, where we become radically just sort of antibody, right, or something. The body's just this thing over here. It's not me. I'm this other thing, right? Whatever that may be, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've even seen it taken to the people try to baptize this idea where they'll say, by me emptying myself and kind of entering into this undefined consciousness, that's how we actually are in communion with each other when we all enter into this.
No.
It's beautiful.
No, it's not.
It's not.
It's
right.
creepy. Whatever the image that comes to me always when people start talking like this. I'm not a big fan of this, but being a 90s guy, the Star Trek: The Next Generation, that was the big thing, right?
Sure.
Well, who was the big enemy in there? The Borg.
The Borg.
Whenever people start talking like that, it's like, you're starting to sound a lot like the Borg to me.
Enter the Borg.
But anyways, so there's a denial that our identity is connected to our bodies, which ends up also then meaning that our identity is not connected to our social relationships, our social standing, right? So this sounds a little weird at first, but so much of our social standing really is connected to our bodies, right? That we're men and women, that we're children of certain parents, that we're parents of certain children, right? That we have certain relationships to other human beings in terms of being fellow citizens, not exclusively, but often because of where our bodies were born, right?
Sure.
So when you really start thinking about it, right, actually the body, denying bodily meaning of yourself ends up also denying, right, the social meaning of yourself,
Right.
in a lot of ways, right? So that you've basically cleared out any sort of given meaning. And it's so fascinating, Jason. I mean, one of the reasons I've kind of gotten into this area is just because it's so multi-leveled, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like peeling an onion. I mean, you just peel it and there's another layer, another layer. But anyways, what we end up with, right, is that the ultimate subject, the ultimate identity of the human being is undefined consciousness, which leaves the person open to define his own consciousness. That's the basic idea, right? And as I think we pointed out last time, that goes very well with the modern ethos of autonomy, right? That I'm not defined by something outside of myself. I'm not defined by God. I'm not defined as a creature in relation to a creator. I define myself, right, according to whatever I want, my project, whatever it is. Yeah.
Right. And even to the point where I can even deny certain social relationships that have, like my parents. I don't have to consider that part of my identity, whereas, again, it's again, holding up autonomy as kind of the highest. And we see this with euthanasia and things like that. Autonomy becomes the highest virtue, and the only thing that we should uphold is a person's autonomy. And it is that center of the part of the onion where, yes, when you get to that part, you're just crying, and it's a sad state of affairs.
Well, it is interesting, right? I mean, because there does seem to be something, and from a Thomist perspective, I understand this to a degree, that there is something about us we want to understand.
Yeah.
And one of the things we want to understand is ourselves.
Sure.
And when we lack self-understanding, and I think this is important, we sort of go astray. We find it difficult to act, to be happy, to relate to others, that sort of thing, right? To find purpose and meaning, right?
Sure.
And I think that's correct. I mean, I think that we do need to understand ourselves. I think understanding ourselves and understanding God are the two main things we need to understand, right? When it really comes down to it. And unfortunately, right, I think the need for self-understanding has been answered by this false idea of the self.
Yeah.
Right. And along with that false idea of the self goes, right, a model of self-understanding that is, I think, erroneous and misleading.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest errors is many times it begins with a simple ignoring of God. That, I mean, but for the Christian to try to understand yourself apart from God, that's impossible.
It's interesting. I had a really interesting conversation with somebody who's been a longtime friend, and he was talking about, he's a little bit older than I am, and he was talking about he had kind of come to a point in his life where he just didn't really understand who he was anymore, wasn't attached to any goals that he had before, that sort of thing. He was just kind of blank, kind of lost, and he lost that self-understanding of that he had before. Now, it was probably an incomplete self-understanding for sure. But it was interesting because in that conversation, I hadn't thought about this particularly in a while, but as a Christian, right, my self-understanding is already given, and it's relational, right? In the sense that I am defined in relation to God, right? As an image of God, as a creature of God, all those sorts of things, right? So I'm never really just trying to find out myself in isolation. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think which is really helpful. Like there's a bigger story. I understand myself through a bigger story and a bigger picture, and that's God's story, right? And that's the picture that includes creator and creature.
Yeah, and like you said, that the beginning place for the Christian understanding of self is an already established relationship.
That's right.
That
That's right.
is
Yeah.
that, it can only be broken on our part. And even when we
Right.
do break it, it doesn't mean that we cease to have been created in his image and likeness.
That's right.
So to have that as a starting point, it's like, you're already halfway through the Appalachian Trail, or something like that. Like you're already, you're way ahead of somebody who's starting from nowhere,
That's right. That's right.
And that's why, I think, we do have a lot of mental health issues today, is because people are trying to start from a point that they are metaphysically, intellectually, like spiritually, that doesn't exist. You're trying to start from a point of again, like you said, it's important that we understand ourselves and our personal identity and things like that. And there's a right way to understand that. But to begin from a false place,
right?
That's it's a non-starter, dude. Like
that's right. Yeah,
you can't start from there. So
yeah. It's like trying to build a house, without any timber. You're just like, like somebody throws you in the ocean and says, "Build a house."
Yeah, good luck with that. From the top down. Yeah, you just can't do it. Right. So how do we begin to understand then, kind of maybe a correct way of understanding, I guess, or to get at self-knowledge?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to do that by maybe I always find it helpful to contrast the truth with the error. So let's start by maybe looking at some of the false way, right?
Sure.
So if you start with a presupposition, right, with the principle that the self is undefined consciousness, then you want to kind of get back there, because you're going to think of yourself, right, as Jason Gale, who is married to a certain person and lives in a certain place and has certain children, is a homeowner and a citizen, right? You're going to be thinking about yourself and those kinds of things. But see, all of that is so laden with definition, right?
Yeah.
From a modern perspective, a modernist perspective, right? That's just all laden with definition. That's not the self, right? That's just all the stuff that society puts on you, right? That's just all the stuff, right, that history puts on you. You need to break free from all that, man, right?
Yeah.
That's that, right? And break through to your true self, right? That's that that's not just a modern spiritual error, although that comes up a lot, and I want to talk about that in a minute. That's something you find in Romanticism, right? Sure. As a reaction to certain elements of the Enlightenment, right? It's, you got to break out from society, right, and find your true self, right, away from social definitions and things of that nature. I think, Jason, sadly, right, you see this approach adopted in a lot of contemporary Catholic spirituality.
Sure.
Where you see not just Catholic but also Protestant, but sadly enough, I mean, some of the worst sources Catholic, where really the spiritual practice, the process of understanding yourself, the process of knowing yourself, really is not. They call it contemplative. And I'm going to go ahead and name some names here, right? Probably the most influential advocate of this is Richard Rohr, who runs what's called the Center for Action and Contemplation. Pretty famous dude, bestseller, all that sort of thing, massively influential. But I also think deeply misguided. And what he sells as contemplation, okay, is not what the philosophers were talking about, for sure. And he would agree with that, by the way. But it's also, I don't think, really genuine Christian contemplation either. One of the reasons I say that is genuine Christian contemplation is intellectually rich. It has an object, right? And the beatific vision is not the beatific blindness. Right. The beatific vision is knowing God in his essence. right? It's an act of understanding, right? Now it's a supernatural, infused act of understanding, right? But it's not darkness, right?
Yeah.
Even when you get to in elements of classical, say, Carmelite spirituality, which include a stage of the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is not the goal. Right? You move through the dark night of the soul, right, to infuse contemplation. Infused contemplation, right, is a kind of supernatural knowing, right? It is kind of overwhelming in its luminosity, right? But that's not because of its darkness, right?
Yeah, and many times that's how contemplation is painted in many of these different areas, where it's kind of, it's either this where the object is the self, and it's the self reflecting on the self, and it just becomes kind of this divine navel gazing, or or it becomes so I've seen it take that form, but I've also seen it, again, like similar to what you were saying, it takes the form of being having nothing to do with the intellect.
That's right. Absolutely.
So we want to empty the intellect of thoughts, because our thoughts are human, and human thoughts are not divine thoughts, and so we need to empty our mind of these of all our humanity. And it just has this like twinge of just false humility that's just maddening as well. Where we want to empty ourselves of human thoughts,
Right.
Well, no, not if our human thoughts are trying to understand divine
that's right
things.
That's right
God.
So here's here's the thing though, and this is the trick. Richard Rohr really develops this, right? Is what you're talking about here is he would just call, well, that's just your separate self, Jason.
Yeah.
When you start thinking and forming definitions and ideas, and again, you find parallels of this in Romanticism and in thinkers like Schleiermacher in Germany. But when you start talking about yourself in terms of thinking, in terms of definitions, well, see, you've already departed from the purity of the undefined consciousness, and you've entered into the separate self, right? So you've created kind of a dualism here, where there's the real self, which is your undefined consciousness, and then there's the thought self, right? That is your little puppet that you've thought up, right? And if anybody's done any work in Hindu philosophy or Buddhist philosophy, this is this just tracks, right? Pretty straightforwardly with those traditions, right? So this is really an importation into Christian thinking of ways of thinking that are not Christian, right? That are parts of false religions. So I'm just gonna, so just so you know, I'm not making this up. I'm gonna just read here a little bit, and I'll send you links to what I'm reading to. I think I already did, actually, Jason.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, good. So true self versus separate self. This is from September 5th on the website Center for Action and Contemplation. At the very top here, says your true self is a little tiny flame of this universal reality that is life itself, consciousness itself, being itself, love itself, light and fire itself. Note, God's very self, right? Thinking creates the separate self, the ego self, the insecure self. The God-given contemplative mind, on the other hand, recognizes the God self, the Christ self, the true self of abundance and deep inner security.
Whoa. Just blew my mind.
Let me just read one more line here. Every one of us is shadowed by an illusory person, a false self. This is the man I want myself to be, but who cannot exist because God does not know anything about him. And to be unknown of God is altogether too much privacy. So there's just so much to say here, Jason. You're a catechist.
Where do I begin?
Is myself identical to the universal reality that is God's self?
No, gosh, no. Why would you ever put yourself in that? Yeah, unless you're Adam and Eve, and this was, before the fall, and you want to put yourself up there. Great. See how that turns out for you.
Yeah, right.
But, that's
you
never
be like
good,
God.
Yeah, we're gonna be like God. Like, yeah, no, and again, it's just. When some of the things you read there, you're like, oh, that sounds weird. But then it's like you throw in this little bit of false humility of, like your own weaknesses. So you want to throw that off and put on, it's the best way I can describe it is that it is sexy. It sounds good to the modern ear.
It does. Mm-hmm.
It's very much what we want to hear, because it kind of it counsels my sinfulness into thinking my sin is not really that bad,
Right.
And it really kind of just strokes my ego. It sounds great to my modern ears. Here I am in my duplicity. In my Catholic ears, it's horrible. I mean, it just
right. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think especially if you say, because you could be a flat materialist, right, and just say this is all bunk.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you were just a flat materialist, you say, like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. Like, the self is just some sort of epiphenomenal byproduct of basic physiological processes.
Yeah.
Right. If you're a materialist, to be perfectly honest, I kind of think at that point, I would actually kind of feel like that the materialist had a healthier perspective. But anyways, I think this is attractive if you want to be kind of modern in terms of endorsing the idea of autonomy, and still want to have some kind of spirituality about you.
Yeah.
You follow me? Right. Like, and this is really interesting. It is very interesting, I think, that if you just write in terms of spirituality, like I was just looking at an article over on Psychology Today, a publication I don't necessarily recommend, but anyways, I was checking it. I like to look at such things from time to time. And, there's a guy on there writing about our need for a new global spirituality. And like, this is a mainstream scientific, right, magazine. And he's writing about the importance of, for health and human happiness, a new global spirituality, right? And you're just like, like, so that just one like illustration of the fact that human beings, even if they want to reject Christianity, even if they want to reject Islam, Judaism, or some kind of religion like that, they still kind of want some spirituality kicking around, right? Of some sort. And this kind of has that feel to it. Again, it's amazingly like Hinduism, right?
Sure. Oh,
in which, right, you have the kind of the outer self and the inner self. And all of life is really about overcoming that outer self and returning. I might have this terminology wrong here. If I get this wrong, please forgive me. But I think it's the Atman, right? That you return back into, right, the one that you were always with, right? And it's interesting, like this spirituality always reduces to a kind of monism. Right.
Yeah.
Right. That is that everything is one. And then that monism always becomes pantheism. Right. Everything is one and everything is God. Right. So let's look at this. Your true self is a little tiny flame of this universal reality that is life itself. Who do we say is life itself? We say that of God.
Yeah. Jesus
right?
Christ.
Being itself, that's God. Love itself, that's God. Right. And then he says God's very self. So you, right, yourself is a flame of that thing, right? So, I mean, it's sounding pretty close to pantheistic monism, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And to the Christian, you throw in some key words there, and they can easily fall for that, and again, it becomes this almost self-worship, in my own abilities, in my own.
Jason, that only makes sense if you are part of God. Yeah. If you're part of God, of course you should worship yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
You should honor yourself.
Yeah, and if I was an evil catechist, I would say, well, in baptism we become, brothers with Christ, right? We become one with him, to where we can say with Jesus, our Father, right? That's true. But not in this way.
Not in this way. It's
I have yet to don my divine mantle with Christ. Right. I will, you're not going to be able to do that here on earth. Like, that's not going to happen. And that's where it takes it just way too far. So I mean, you can find it's just evil. It's
It
just
is, yeah. It takes you really. It's like I say, a false conception of reality and a false conception of philosophy and theology of God, doctrine of God. And the next phrase there that I was reading, in the next paragraph, thinking creates the separate self. So this is how you get back to. So in that first line, where I'm talking about your true self is basically God. That's really where you get to. That's the ultimate realization, right?
yeah.
That's the ultimate spiritual truth, the ultimate self, right? That you find there. But the way you get there is by realizing that thinking creates the separate self, the ego self, the insecure self, right? And that's this. There's this idea. There's a double self here now, right? There's the true self,
Mm-hmm.
which is undefined consciousness. We find out really it's God, right? But in front of that, and kind of obscuring and hiding that truth from you, Jason, is your thinking self, right?
Thank you for
You're
letting
thinking
me
about,
know.
oh, this there might, you're thinking about yourself as a Catholic, and you have certain beliefs and duties, and a catechist,
Yeah.
all that stuff. That's just your separate self, man. Right?
Thank you for now. I understand.
Now, what I always want to ask is, like, does that also include like your duties as being a husband and a father, or it's just that like separate self, not true self? Can you just
honey, stop trying to tell myself separate self to emerge. I'm really trying to enjoy my true self.
Yeah.
And I think it like maybe a good way to understand it is, there's many heresies out there, like,
Right.
Arianism, which denies Christ's divinity, so it reduces God in his divinity. Like where this thing goes wrong is it not only reduces God in his divinity, but it also falsely raises man to something he's not. So I mean, it seems to be this kind of double error of both being heretical against who God is, but also who we are. And
Right.
so I mean, like, nothing good is going to come out of this.
That's right. So let's go. Let's look a little bit more
Sure.
here. This is from September 2nd, Wednesday, September 2nd. Again, this is by Richard Rohr. And it's it's on his website. It's called The True Self / Separate Self, and the subtitle is Trusting in the True You. So here we go again, right? There's two yous now, right, Jason? There's the false you, which is the separate self, the public self, the thinking self, right? One that is definable by propositions and descriptions, right?
Sure.
But then there's the deeper self, right? So let's read a little bit here. Again, this is from Trusting in the True You. Our separate self is who we think, the word is italicized, who we think we are, right?
There you go, thinking again.
Thinking, right? Thought is bad. It's so interesting how often this comes out, right? Is that thinking is and propositions and definitions. This is always why I kind of caution people, especially when they're, say, new converts or something like that. There's maybe sometimes a temptation to jump into the deepest pools of the Catholic mystical tradition because it's beautiful. It is.
Let's read John
deep,
of the Cross.
Right. I kind of would say let's take baby steps here a little bit, right? Right, because that's a deep pool, and sometimes we can come away with, oh, thought's bad, propositions are bad, right? And that's false. That's false. Very interestingly, there's a book by Thomas Merton, who I don't actually recommend on these matters because he really went astray in the later career.
Sure.
But in his first half of his career, really was not. He wrote a book called Ascent to Truth. Yeah. And it's about his last good one. And it was about St. John of the Cross. And in there, he cautions very strongly against the anti-cognitive versions of mysticism, right? Which is really interesting because later on, he really embraces that when he kind of takes a Buddhist turn, right? But in that earlier book, right, he's really, we can't, like, genuine spirituality is not anti-cognitive, right? But here we have very clearly the problem here is you're thinking, you're defining, you're describing. You see how appealing this is to kind of like a relativistic approach, how appealing this is to a nihilistic approach, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, the fact that we are, like, does he not understand? Like, he just said, thinking, our separate self is who we think we are. Well, right now we are reading an article by somebody else who's telling us who our true self is. Like, we have to process words and articles and
Jason,
and
you're just
complete
caught up
ideas.
in your logic self. You need to break free of, you're trying to say he's being inconsistent. You just need to break free of all that logic stuff.
All right, I'll stop thinking. All right, go ahead.
Yeah. But our thinking does not make it true. It is a social mental construct that gets us started on life's journey. It is a set of agreements between us as individuals and our parents, blah, blah, blah. It is our container.
Yeah.
It is largely defined in distinction from others precisely as our separate and unique self. It's probably necessary to get started, but becomes problematic. So again, and I've noticed this across many different spectrums, right?
Sure.
This, we need to realize we're all one, right? I mean, it's like the John Denver song, right? Basically, right? I mean, am I saying that right? Is Imagine, who's that about?
No, John Lennon.
John Lennon, sorry about that, John Denver.
Yeah, John Denver's great. Don't ever trash John.
Sorry, pop culture's not my strength.
Right.
Oh yeah. But yeah, it's like we're all one, right? Imagine we're all one. What's evil is thinking that you're different than somebody else, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, excessive individualism can be a problem, but the fact that you're an individual distinct from others is not evil. It's just true. Right? I mean, I don't know what to say. Like, I remember like having a conversation with it, and I remember this guy kept saying, well, man, we're really one. And I kept saying, no, we're not. Right?
Yeah.
Like, you're not the father of my children. Right?
Like,
I am their only father, and that's not true of anyone else, right? In terms of their being their biological father. There's the fact that we can define ourselves as unique and separate is not bad. Right. People just have a obsession about this right now. I think this kind of spirituality is part of that.
But I think a big part of it is, and this is my own kind of diagnosis, is, I mean, there's these, again, the way that God created us, that there's these tendencies, these longings, these desires within us for the eternal, right? There's I think that's one of the biggest things is we long for eternity, and because of that, we fall into we can fall into false ideas like, okay, eternity really, I mean, the idea of eternity has no boundaries. So the idea of an undefined consciousness, well, that sounds great. That sounds like eternity because there's no limitations. And as soon as you start defining things, Dr. Smith, you're putting limitations on eternity, and you can't do that.
Yeah,
so it's weird.
Yeah, so push back. There is only one unlimited, right? Mm-hmm. And it's God, right?
Yeah.
There is only one truly one without beginning, and that's God, right? And that's what's so like this underlying this is always, it always collapses back into monistic pantheism, right? As the other great alternative, I think, to classical theism. A whole world civilizations, right, are organized around this idea. Mm-hmm. Really a lot of Hinduism and a lot of strains of Buddhism are organized around the idea of monistic pantheism.
Sure.
Right. Western civilization didn't take that route.
Yeah.
Right. We took a different route, which is interesting. Neither did Near Eastern civilization. Right. They didn't take that route either. Right. Let me just keep reading here. I think you're right, though, Jason. He goes on to say the separate self. So this is that part of yourself that's definable. That's that version of yourself is bogus. Right.
Yeah.
We need the temporary costumes of the egos of our ego selves, costumes. So you're being a husband is a costume, right? To get
I'll tell my wife that.
Right. So going on down here a little bit further, he says, when we find our true self, right, we have discovered the true freedom and liberation, right? So the true self is undefined by all that. Here, check this out. Because it's undefined, when we are connected to the whole, we no longer need to protect, defend the smaller parts. We're connected to something inexhaustible and unhurtable. The true self cannot be hurt.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
true
it's
you
impassable.
the true you is indestructible.
That's right. Yeah, it literally says that, right? Now, again, so he says, if we do not let go of our separate self, false self, at the right time, the right way, we remain stuck, trapped, and addicted, right?
Yeah.
The traditional word for this was sin.
Yeah.
What? That's a total no. Sin is a violation of God's law. That's what sin is, right? Um, it goes on to say, unfortunately, many people reach old age still entrenched in their egoic operating system. Our only true self lives forever and is truly free in this world.
Yeah. See, there's that eternity there. Yeah. It's just,
but so
yeah,
it's just a lot to say here. But what you can see is the idea of self-understanding, and that's what I really want to focus on here.
Sure.
This idea of self-understanding goes with an understanding of the self, or a model of the self, and leads to a metaphysical picture that's wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And an error. Right. So you start with the idea self is undefined consciousness. How do you get to it? By thinking away, by eliminating, by detaching from, even if just internally, okay, detaching from those elements of self-definition, right? So wherever you can find something that defines yourself, that's self. You come to recognize, oh, that's separate self, or whatever you want to call it, right? And I detached from that internally, and that gives me the opportunity to be at rest, right? To rest in my true self, which is this undefined consciousness. Now, one of the things really interesting, I've spent some time studying Buddhist philosophy and Hindu philosophy, and I've even spent a good bit of time kind of reading work on Buddhist meditation and the methods of Buddhist meditation. One of the things you do in this kind of meditation, right, is you try to let all of your thoughts float away.
Yeah.
Right. It's very important. Your sensations first, right? You start by sitting very still.
Yeah.
You start, and then you try to let your you try to stop sensing. Now, you don't tell yourself stop sensing, right? You learn certain techniques by which
keyword.
Yeah. Keywords, certain things you can do that will, and it is interesting, right? I mean, certain techniques that make it to where you're less aware of your body. Right, less aware of what's going on around you, less aware of of sound, things of that nature, right? Once you get to that state, right, you're supposed to detach from thought, right? How do you do that? Well, when the thoughts start happening, you just sort of note them and then return to this one place of blank awareness. Now, it could be lots of different things, but you focus on this one thing, like your breath, right? That's one of the techniques, right? You just say, oh, I'm thinking about what I need to do Tuesday. Well, I just let that go. So noted, and return to your breath. Right? And so you keep following these techniques over and over again, right? And eventually what you're supposed to do is you're no longer aware of thinking. You're no longer aware of sensation. You're just in your awareness, right?
Yeah.
That's finding your true self. And then at some point, if you do this enough, right, you come to recognize your true self, right, as connected to the whole, as part of God, as this little flame, etc. Right?
Yeah, so I didn't have to read all those books like you. I was just catechized in the 80s, so it was like just built into
Okay.
That was no, this is centering prayer, like so much, like I didn't like purposefully enter into centering prayer. I was kind of put in a situation where I had to try to participate, and it was weird. And again, the whole time, later on realizing it more. I mean, it's Buddhism. This idea of just letting everything go, even letting all thoughts. When a thought comes, you say your keyword or something, and you acknowledge that thought, but then let it go.
Right.
And it's just but there, at no point in your emptying do you attempt to fill that up with God's presence, God's grace, a thought about God. Like, and that was the thing. Like, I was poorly catechized early on, and so the whole time I'm like, when do we get to God? Like, I didn't know much. But I knew that, like at some point we should arrive at God.
Right.
And all I was arriving at was my own stupid thoughts, I mean, just, yeah, I mean, and that was the thing. It was like, there was, it was empty. It
Sure,
just like its method was also its product. It was just empty.
That's true. Yeah. But, I think something about it, Jason, is that I think people find it's almost a mechanical way of producing a kind of interior peace.
Yeah.
I think it's a kind of mechanical way of producing a kind of escape from anxiety.
Sure. Yeah, well, and that's why, like, even like the new term now is mindfulness, right? So even like the practice of mindfulness, even that has like really gone into secular psychology as like a genuine form of like therapy. Because it or at least it says it produces this at least internal I'll say internal stillness. I don't know if it's necessarily peace. But it's this stillness which the person may lack, right?
Yeah. And I'll say, I mean, some of the criticisms is the right word, some of the observations right, that people like Richard Rohr would make will sound a lot like good philosophical or good ascetic theology, right? Where we recognize that that our lives are probably too busy. We probably do spend too much time thinking about reputation.
Yeah.
I mean? So there's a lot that you could say, like, hey, yeah, like our lives are kind of screwed up right now. I think especially in the modern world, way too busy, frenetic, ego-driven in bad ways, right? In the sense of like, look at how many, likes I get on Facebook and that's my self-worth, all that kind of stuff. So in a large measure, because I kind of agree, right? Like with the critique of the frenetic and superficial and materialistic elements of much of modern life. This is not the solution, though.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. The diagnosis may be correct. We lack peace, but the like you said, the solution to it is just going to exacerbate the problem.
That's right. Like, right. Absolutely. It's just gonna make it worse, and I think replace it with something worse. To be honest.
Oh yeah.
I know we're probably reaching our time limit here. We'll have to just do a follow-up podcast on the kind of genuine self-knowledge. But one of the things I think that's interesting here is when you're looking at it from this kind of looking at things from this perspective, right? As a Christian, you think most of the heresies, right, in the early church involved an excessive Platonism, in which there was denial of the significance of the body, right. Our religion, Christianity, is a wordy religion. In fact, the second person of the Holy Trinity calls himself the Word, right? It's a religion that communicates truth and conceptual content, right? And at the end of the day, I think that's very important to recognize, right? And also, it's a relational religion, right? That is, when you have a friend, right? When you have a spouse, when you have a Lord, that's not a blankness, right? That is content rich. Okay.
Yeah.
You don't know someone by sinking into yourself, right? And losing all definition, right? You know someone by coming to know them, right? By listening to them, by talking, right? By doing things with them, doing things for them, etc. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me of that book Ready Player One, where it's a great kind of modern sci-fi, where there's this alternative world called the Oasis, where
Mm.
that's where people go and they interact there, but they never interact really in real life. And real life is just this dystopic nightmare, but everybody just puts their headsets on and enters the Oasis, where they can be whoever they want to be, and like all these
Oh
things.
my word.
Yeah, it's a great novel, great. But yeah, it's this I think a lot of it is sometimes kind of our sinful desires of wanting to already be in the eternal, and wanting to kind of I don't want to say ignore our sins, but I mean, like, but not confront them, and that, it's hard when you have to confront your sins and your own sinfulness.
Sure. Right,
And this is why, I think, like, St. Paul, I mean, he correctly, addresses that in, because somebody may be thinking, well, what about, there's that line in Ephesians 4 where St. Paul says, to put on the new self. Well, right before he says put on the new self, he talks about the old self, which is sin, which is a sinful life, that they, greedy to practice every kind of impurity, like they were, it was a life full of sin. And to put on the new self is to, again, and this is kind of what we're aiming at, is to have that self-knowledge in relationship to God, not despite our relationship with God, or not to equivocate ourselves with God, because we, we're not that little divine flame, but to understand ourselves in that way. And when we do that we can understand the new self. It's not this, but again, we don't, it's not this duplicity of selves that are, so, I think for many people, with regards to this duplicity of selves, this kind of this modern dualism or whatever, it's important to understand those and be able to pinpoint those errors, especially within Catholic, like the Center for Action and Contemplation, to recognize these in Catholic circles, or many of the things about Catholic mindfulness and things that, again, what is the object? Where are you going to arrive? Well, you need to arrive at God at some point, and not yourself.
Sure. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well spoken. Jason, next time maybe we'll follow up and talk about the positive alternative, and kind of the genuine form of self-understanding. I want to just close by apologizing to John Denver and to all his fans. Thanks a lot.
That's right. It is right and just, Dr. Smith. So, all right. Well, I hope we've given our listeners a lot to think about here, and do your own research. Look up, kind of these things. Understand that they're out there, and they may work themselves into your parish life or something like that, or you may get articles or things like that sent to you from friends, or friends may ask you. It's important, again, go back to some classical spirituality. Again, the focus is always on God, and there's a true humility that's there, and it's really just absent of any Buddhism or Hindu spirituality. Those kind of things are just antithetical to Christianity. And so I want to encourage all of our listeners, go check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. You can see classes from Dr. Smith and Dr. Richard Buzzelli in theology and philosophy. And you can check out Dr. Smith's articles on the myth of self for kind of more of a diagnosis. And so until next time, God bless.